It's like a frog in a pot of boiling water. If you heat
Yeah.
it slowly, then the realization doesn't happen, and that's what happens in when it comes to heat waves, because the morning are usually cooler,
Yeah.
and slowly the temperature starts to build up. The material starts to absorb these heat, and then probably around noon or post noon, it becomes very severe when the sun is
Yeah.
at its peak.
You are listening to Understanding the Future podcast. I am the host Punit Gandhi, and this podcast is developed in association with Climate Center for Cities under the National Institute of Urban Affairs and the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. This is a podcast where we discuss about the future of work in the field of climate change, urban development, innovation, and sustainability with the help of leaders and visionaries working on ground as well as in the top management of public and private sector. Our objective is to better understand the future so that we can be prepared and intervene to enable climate actions in the urban areas.
Hello, everyone. I am Punit Gandhi, the host of the podcast Understanding the Future. And today we have with us Dr. Umamaheshwaran Rajasekar, Head Climate Center for Cities and Chair Urban Resilience Unit at National Institute of Urban Affairs. Dr. Umamahesh will help us in understanding the future of urban heat islands. Welcome to the show, Dr. Umamahesh.
Hi, Panat. Hello, everyone.
It's great to have you over here. So I would like to start our conversation with understanding what do we mean by urban heat islands?
So, urban heat islands, in theory, they are a difference in the land surface and air surface temperature in comparison to the rural surrounding. So, urban area usually comprises of peri-urban areas and also surrounding rural areas. So, the difference in heat is basically causing the effect of urban heat island.
Okay, and what are the major causes that these things happen in any urban areas?
Usually, the primary cause for a heat island effect is the land use and also the land cover.
Okay,
Predominantly, it is dominated by the land cover, irrespective of the land use in many cases.
okay. And and you have done a PhD in this field as well. So if you can just give a brief about your journey in this field, that would be great for the audience.
So, my PhD was on mathematically quantifying the extent of heat difference between urban and rural areas using spatio-temporal analysis. So, what I basically did was I took around 2,000 to 3,000 images over varying time scale and try to study how the heat island effect changes with change in seasons, change during day and night, and also change during different landforms, that is usually the land cover. Post which I also did work, got an opportunity to modeling some of the heat islands in Indian cities and also try to work around mitigating and adaptation effects, usually in the residential buildings. You know, how people can achieve thermal comfort with differential heat, and how people can also use certain materials over the surface to basically reduce the impact of urban heat island effect. One of the major thing which is very important to notice, the difference in the heat impact of across various services and also outside the city and also within the city is quite large. So when the Met Department reports that today's temperature is say 30 degrees, usually it's not 30 degrees pan city. It is 30 degrees at the Met station. What it actually means is some areas may be experiencing 35 to 36 degrees, and some areas may experience around 25 to 26 degrees. So this depends upon the larger effect.
Okay. And then why do we have just one or two? Like this is just in continuation to this. one or two stations in the city, like even Bombay as the largest, one of the very big cities also has maybe 2 to 3 met stations. Why do not we have more met stations to take better readings?
Uh, there are multiple issues associated with it. The Met Department is taking readings for their global models and also pan India regional models. So
Okay.
for them, that's where they have installed these stations and are also maintaining and operating them. Usually, you'll find stations installed in airports where it's very critical for the flight takeoff and landing and things like that. But it is also established in certain places where they can maintain and monitor it at a continuous period of time over a day, over a week, over a month, and so on and so forth. So that
Yeah.
mandate is limited. But when it comes to urban area, of course, it's important to have more number of stations. And
Yeah.
that's where there needs to be a larger partnership. We can't expect the Met Department alone installing all these stations because the variation in urban area is quite high. Within
Yeah.
100 square meters, you will find varying degree of temperature. If you're on an asphalt road or if you're on a bitumen road, it's a different temperature, right? And if
Yeah.
you're on a footpath which is covered by tree, it's a different temperature. So we need more, stations. We need more sensors across it. But the
Yeah.
bigger question is whether it needs to be maintained by the Met Department because the cost of operating it is quite
Mm.
high, not cost of purchasing it.
Okay. So operation, because it is not automatic that it gets generally high, just out of curiosity, or is it
So
maintaining the sensors?
yes, of course, nowadays you have a lot of automated weather stations available.
Yeah.
But Met Department follows a certain guidelines. They have to keep it in a 100 square feet or 200 square feet open space. It has to be fenced so that it is not disturbed by people. And
Okay.
it has to follow certain regulation guidelines in terms of height, in terms of things which they have standardized it across the country. But
Yeah.
in urban setting, getting a space, getting such area
Yeah.
in the middle of the city is very difficult,
Yeah.
right? So there needs to be a different set of guidelines which have to be brought in to involve people who are recording temperatures and rainfall in their balcony or in their house
Yeah.
or in their community. So the
Yeah.
guidelines needs to be relaxed, and there needs to be a different set of process to compiling, verifying, and also collating these information.
Yeah. And that, as much as I know, there is a good amount of open weather maps that works on it, at least in USA or Europe. But in India, I'm not sure if we have that many amount of stations to do that kind of close monitoring in each area. Would you comment on it somewhere?
Right, I do agree. The awareness in terms of installing these stations and the benefit which individuals get is still not yet capitalized to its full extent in India. But that
Yeah.
said, there are a lot of private players who are already into this, but they are more in the rural areas, especially for the farmers, in terms of providing them weather predictions, providing them certain inputs in terms of when to sow, when to use water, and so on and so forth. So much is being done at a rural setting, but very little is currently being done at an urban setting.
Okay. Okay. So coming back to the topic of your PhD and urban heat island, what were some of the interesting things that you found out with landforms and seasonal variations and even thermal comfort inside homes? How can we manage it better?
Right. So one of the critical thing which came up, I think two things which may be interesting to the audience. One, in an urban surface, when we, especially in US, because my case study was US, that
Okay.
they have something called downtown, which is the commercial business district,
Yeah.
and usually they are comprised of high-rise buildings.
Yeah.
So due to latent shading and the buildings actually create a shading effect on the pavements and on the roads. So if you look at the CBD, which we thought that will have a high temperature because of the concrete buildings and things like that,
Yeah.
it didn't happen that way. The temperature difference was not that high. Actually, it has in the CBD districts in US, the
Yeah.
temperature actually comes down. It actually cools down. The second
Okay.
thing which we also observed is, especially in cities which are surrounded by farmlands,
Yeah.
or agricultural lands. So
Mm.
when these agricultural lands are fallow, I mean, when they are not irrigated, or during certain months they are kept fallow, they are not,
Yeah.
there's no sowing or farming happening around, usually post monsoon and during winter months and so on and so forth. During those times, what we have realized is the bare soil actually radiates more heat, because of which there is a negative heat island effect which takes place. So the rural areas becomes much more hotter than the urban area, because of large fields of tracts of land, start
Mm.
absorbing heat during the day, and they start radiating heat during the evening periods. So that's also one of the key things which came out, that we are not only talking about heat islands, we are also
Yeah.
talking about heat sinks.
Yeah. Okay. And then coming to one thing that I feel is a lot talked about is the kind of region that our buildings are in. And accordingly, the thermal comfort has to be defined in the building, and accordingly, buildings have to be designed. Do we have something specific region wise diversification in India, or is it still adopted from what is used across the world?
See, if you look at our built forms
Yeah.
over centuries, I think in India, people started using certain construction techniques and materials based on what is available in the local area.
Yeah.
And also the design of many of these buildings, older buildings, did take into consideration the temperature effect. And usually you see a lot when you enter any old building, you just see that the air circulation is quite good, and you
Yeah.
also see the spaces, the ceiling heights are quite good, and even the space for movement is quite good. These things actually bring down the temperature to a larger degree. But
Yeah.
in the modern day, because of the availability of space and also the change in the material type, most people are shifting towards concrete. Either they are going for frame structure, and
Yeah.
very few people are actually, because when you do a brick and mortar, you can't go beyond 4 or 5 stories. It doesn't make sense. So people usually tend to go towards concrete, which absorbs a lot of heat, which also radiates a lot of heat,
Yeah.
and the sizes have come down, the ceiling heights have come down, air circulation is not much thought about. People want these big windows. Of
Yeah.
course, they don't keep the windows open, they keep it closed. So there is the heat which comes in, but not the wind. So these
Yeah.
are some of the issues with the recent demand for housing, at least in the urban setting.
Okay. And what kind of problems does this cause in the city? What all kind of challenges does this bring in the city if this is not managed right now?
See, one of the biggest thing is, if you take 2019, more than 70% of India's population was exposed to high temperature, you know,
Hmm.
what they call it as heat wave. According to our IMD, they define heat wave as two things. One, if the temperature goes beyond 40, goes above 40 degrees centigrade. And also the difference, year to year difference in mean temperature, if it goes above 5 degrees, then they also call that as a heat wave. Pretty much 70% of the population across India was exposed to heat waves. And many of them, the impacts vary depending upon the vulnerability of the people who were exposed to it. Aged people were more affected. People with certain issues related to dehydration and things like that were quite high. But a lot of people also die out of heat wave. Unfortunately, in India, heat wave is considered as a disaster only by one state, the state of Odisha. But other
Okay.
states do not consider heat wave as a disaster. Therefore, the recording, if somebody succumbs to heat wave, they usually record it as a natural death,
Yeah.
or they attribute it to age. The person was old, therefore they died naturally, and they don't relate it to the heat exposure. That has to change over time. States, even though some of the states are not that much impacted by the heat wave, they should still consider urban areas and have certain specific protocols to start recording it. Once we start recording the kind of impact which people are facing, then
Yeah.
I think the case of doing certain mitigation and adaptation activities will also take place.
Yeah. And this high vulnerability risk for especially people who are exposed to that kind of job, because I was reading one of the McKinsey reports and they had mentioned that around 50% of 50% of our workforce which produces GDP is the labor force which technically works in this kind of areas where they will be exposed to heat waves, and that is a very big hazard. Do we have certain guidelines on those lines to at least that, okay, if our temperature is heading above 40 degrees or 45 degrees in that city, the construction needs to stop or something?
Like I said, in Odisha, they do follow that. During summer
Okay.
months, I think most of the job people who are working outside,
Yeah.
they are asked to stop work during peak heat period, which is
Yeah.
usually between 2 to 5 or 3 to 5 p.m.
Yeah.
So they are asked to stop work and they then resume the work in the evening, post
Yeah.
5:30. People are also asked not to go out. Now, there are certain cities which where they are providing warnings to people, alerts to people that please avoid going outside between noon to probably 3 to 4 p.m. So those kinds of
Yeah.
advisories are being sent to people.
Okay.
But all said and
Okay.
done, it is until unless there is a larger realization of the impacts,
Yeah.
people take it easy. It's like a frog in a pot of boiling water. If you heat
Yeah.
it slowly, then the realization doesn't happen, and that's what happens in when it comes to heat waves, because the morning are usually cooler,
Yeah.
and slowly the temperature starts to build up. The material starts to absorb these heat, and then probably around noon or post noon, it becomes very severe when the sun is
Yeah.
at its peak.
Yeah. And so there is something that again is being called out a lot right now is the humidity factor in this heat waves, and how can you give us a brief about that? That how does it affect and what happens with the humidity coming into picture?
Right. So there is something called heat index. Heat
Okay.
index is a combination of temperature and relative humidity. So probably heat index is indicates the comfort factor which human beings feel for a certain temperature and humidity. So
Yeah.
temperature alone is not usually the killer. It is the temperature combined with the relative humidity. Actually, the kind of impact it has on people is quite severe. So, for example, if the temperature is 30 degrees and if the relative humidity is quite high, eight,
Yeah.
above 80 or so, then probably the feels like factor will be more than 30 degrees. It will be around 35 degrees or 36 degrees. So that's what you feel like even though the temperature is low. And mostly the heat index is not used for giving heat wave warning, even though it is being considered and it's been brought into play, especially coastal cities or cities where the humidity is quite high do have a larger, they need to be worried about it a bit more and start taking actions around it.
Okay. Because generally in coastal cities, the winds would be blowing more often than not, either inland or outland. And my assumption would be that that would take away heat with it. Doesn't it happen like that?
So, wind has a role to play.
Yeah.
It not only wind has a positive and also negative role to play.
Okay.
So, the positive role is what you are mentioning, that during the evenings there is a cooler breeze which comes
Yeah.
from the sea to the land,
Yeah.
and that basically reduces the extent of heat wave or urban heat island effect.
Okay.
But during the daytime, say for example, during 2 or 3 o'clock, when the temperature is already quite high, and there
Yeah.
is also latent heat which starts getting emitted by these surfaces, especially
Yeah.
concrete surfaces or tar roads or bitumen roads, and then there is a wind, then it starts carrying that heat around areas where there is no radiant heat also. Say for example, if there is a park and it's close to open area, which starts radiating huge amount of heat. So even if you're in the park under a shaded tree, you still get to feel the hot air blowing towards you,
Yeah.
and that's because of this factor. The heat gets carried from one part to another part through wind.
Okay, that's quite interesting. So coming to the point where how do we mitigate these kind of things in urban areas? How do we make sure that we can reduce the amount of urban heat in every city possible?
So there are two things one can do. The primary factor or the mitigating factor which one can cope and people are also doing is planting more trees and planting more green, creating more green areas within the city. In India, even though the TCPO has regulated that any city, all cities should have a minimum of 12% of green areas. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, many of the cities don't have 12%. It's usually less than 12%. Some of the cities don't even have 5% of green area within it.
Wow.
So strategically planting trees is going to be very critical rather than randomly planting trees. Also selecting the type of trees is going to play a key role, and also maintaining those trees. Many a times there are these tree planting campaigns
Yeah.
where people plant 1 lakh or 2 lakh saplings, but by the time you come after 2 or 3 years, only 5,000 or 6,000 of those samplings survive to become a plant or have a possibility of growing into a tree.
Yeah.
So that needs to be addressed. Rather than having a campaign as a one-day affair, we should have a campaign which is continuous, where things are monitored, things are scoped, and people are also informed what is the difference in the uh, heat or the heat island effect it is creating. That is the one aspect which all citizens can be part of. The second thing is also using how do we intervene with respect to built forms, what you call it as anthropogenic heat,
Okay.
where we have changed the land cover quite a bit, at least in the urban areas. So in the
Okay.
buildings, can we have plants and rooftop gardens? That is one thing. Or even if they don't want to have a rooftop garden, they should have the roof. Certain cool roof technologies are available, where
Okay.
there are paints, there are ways in which you limit the amount of heat which falls into the surface. Basically, you create reflective surfaces to basically prevent the excess heat getting into the building.
Yeah.
Also, there is ENS, which is Eco Nivas Smriti, which has been introduced by the government. These are cool roofing and passive ventilation technologies, which could be adopted in most of the residential buildings. This is to reduce the extent of indoor temperature, you know,
Yeah.
and also to create certain kind of thermal comfort for people.
Okay, those are quite interesting. And coming to the point of strategically planting trees, can we map where the heat island is arising from and how is it arising, and accordingly plant trees? Is it possible to do that?
Yes, it's very, very much possible to do that. Right now, we have quite a bit of satellite data. Going back to your initial question,
Yeah,
we don't have that many number of ground-based sensors, but
yeah,
there are certain satellites which have an overpass pretty much across most major cities in India on a daily basis. Even if not on a daily basis, there are good high resolution imageries, thermal imageries, which can be captured once a month. You
okay,
know, just making use of that satellite data, you get the differential heat across the city at a very fine resolution. Once you
okay,
get that, then you can compare it with the few monitoring stations or weather stations we have within the city.
okay,
This is the layout, how each area is, at least the land surface temperature is, it gets radiated or emitted, can be used to strategically plant trees across the city. We can identify areas which are more hot and push our interventions within those areas or
okay,
target interventions within those areas.
okay. So there is a lot of so coming to satellite and ground data and how does it interact. There is a lot of buzz around low cost sensors now across different verticals. Is it possible to do the same to get more ground data so that we can facilitate that with satellites?
Yes, if you're just monitoring temperatures uh, across the city, I think the sensors are very, very cheap. You can get it less than 1,000 or 2,000 rupees, and you can have it installed and you can monitor the temperature at a regular basis. Most of the cars right now, they also have temperature sensors. They measure what is the temperature outside and they also measure what is the temperature inside.
Yeah.
So that is another huge data set, but nobody talks about that. Most of the cars which are coming in
Hmm.
nowadays, the new ones which are getting launched, they have a huge amount of sensors. They also collect information. So we need to crowdsource this. We can easily crowdsource this information. We can
Okay.
easily use low-cost sensors. We can easily use the available infrastructure and mechanism which are there to create a much more robust picture of the city, and that can be used in tandem with the satellite data, and can be used for taking strategic decisions.
Okay. And there is a requirement of both, I'm assuming, because the amount of wider area that satellite can cover, ground-based sensors cannot cover, and the kind of resolution ground-based sensors would give, satellite would not give. Am I correct to assume that?
So the difference is satellite gives you the outside temperature or the surface
Hmm.
temperature.
Hmm.
The sensors can also give you indoor temperatures, you know,
Okay.
and inside a building, inside your house, inside a room, inside a certain space, and they can also do an outside. They can also provide outside temperature when you take it and move around and you start calculating the location.
Okay.
It's a point data when it comes to these sensors. When it comes to satellites, it's a surface data. So apart from it,
Okay.
I think both are can be used for uh, different purposes.
Okay. Okay. So what are some of the current challenges in mapping this kind of ecosystem with satellites or ground-based data that we face in this time and day?
So there are two major challenges. One is the technical know-how is still limited to few professionals who do work in this particular domain of spatial temporal analysis. So we need more tools so that larger participation is possible.
Hmm.
And the second biggest challenge is the awareness, which I keep talking about, because our heat wave and heat impact is limited to 3 months or 4 months in a year.
Hmm.
So whenever when the summers start, people do discuss about heat waves and heat impacts and urban heat islands. And as we move towards winter, right, like right now, people are talking about cold waves and
Yeah.
how do you heat up your buildings and how do you stay warm and safe. So the debate changes
Yeah.
quite a bit. So it becomes very difficult to have a sustained interventions and initiative spanning across the year. So that is something which needs to be thought about.
And something on these lines, Ahmedabad was also brought in something called a heat action plan. Could you give us some brief about that? That how does the city try to facilitate this whole process?
So this was done by a group of institutions, of course, under the direction of Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation.
Okay.
And Gujarat being a semi-arid zone and Ahmedabad being one of the cities where heat impact is also affecting your life and also your lifestyle and
Yeah.
also in the way economy functions and people moving around the city when a heat wave is taking place and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So the heat action plan is very necessary. It is also Ahmedabad came up with this idea of working with some of the research institutions in coming up with a broad level strategy. You
Okay.
know, what is the heat difference? How much people are getting affected? And when are people getting affected? At what temperature? Warnings and alerts should be rolled out, and whom it should be rolled out, and what are the simple measures which can be done across the city to prevent the impact on
Yeah.
life and life. So they had the strategy included where to set up, points where people can get water. Generally water is not available for free, but they had these stalls, identified areas where these stalls can be put up by community, by community-led organizations, by NGOs. They also came up with an idea of how do you communicate the alerts and warnings to the people, because sometimes when I say 30 degrees to somebody, it doesn't bring in the same impact as I'm going to say that heat combined with relative humidity is going to make your
Yeah.
life difficult for a period of 3 to 4 hours. So how do you communicate? That was something which they discussed within the heat action plan. And also they identified certain areas for tree plantations and things like that.
Okay. Coming to the point of Climate Smart Cities Assessment Framework, how is this topic being dealt over there?
So the Climate Smart City Assessment Framework has 5 thematic areas and 28 indicators. One of the thematic areas is urban planning, green cover, and biodiversity. Within that, one of the indicator is about looking at urban heat island mapping, also looking in terms of the green spaces, also looking in terms of how much of the native tree species is being promoted and is being, it exists within the city so that it helps in mitigating the heat. So these are some things which are being captured. Right now, it is being captured for 139 cities. So we will know the status, how many cities have started looking in terms of the heat action plan, how many cities have started mapping. Basically, if you need to bring an action plan, you need information to guide you.
Yeah.
It can't be a random aspect of during summers, I will inform people, I'll provide alerts. It doesn't work that way. So we are looking at 5 stages of development. That is, do have they started thinking about it? And we are also looking in capturing whether they have started forming committees and expert groups, because to guide the municipal corporation in doing such analysis. The third stage is, are they doing the analysis and is the analysis made available to the people at large? And using that analysis, the fourth stage is, are they starting implementing some mitigation and adaptation measures? And if so, what is the impact of those measures? So these are the 5 stages which we are looking at and trying to guide cities, identifying the challenge, or is it more in terms of implementing actions to mitigate those challenges?
Okay, that's quite interesting. And then coming to the part that once they start adapting to it and start mitigating it, are there currently any companies or startups working on particular this sector, and how are they trying to manage it, if they are?
There are a lot of startups which are working in this particular area, varies drastically. One of the things which some of the startups are doing is, at least in terms of green cover, how do you increase the green cover? How do you measure or map the green cover? How do you do certain things during heat waves? What is the nearest emergency place, and how are affected by it? How things can be done? Like I said, it is very limited to 3 months in a year. So if at all a startup needs to be successful, they need to have a business plan which spans across a year,
Yeah.
or activities plans across a year. So many of the things are add-on, or where they are taking into consideration the heat. But I've not come across a startup which says that I will develop heat action plan across the country.
Okay.
That's it to come.
Okay. I hope they do come, because I feel as the urban population increases and the urban areas increases, that would be quite important for everyone, for socio-economic reasons as well. Uh, so coming to one of the last questions that we generally have is on lines of skill sets. And urban heat island effect is very important topic. Where do you see more focus should be to develop expertise in this field, so that more and more people can approach this field? Or if there are existing fields which can also leverage their input or output from urban into urban heat island effect, what will those fields be?
So the first and foremost thing is, how do we demystify this topic?
Yeah.
Because heat is something which is felt, realized, and by almost all human beings. You
Yeah.
know, so it's a much more easier thing when you look at it. If you talk about something like COVID, which people can't touch, feel, and see, And I think the aspect of heat is something which is one can touch, feel, and also in some cases see.
Yeah.
Uh, it's more easier that way, but of course, it is a technical topic. And how do we demystify it? Something which people should invest their time and energy on. And rather than concentrating on different kinds of mathematical functions and principles which do exist, what is more needed across the people are simple tools where they provide data and it gives them certain things, what to do, what not to do. If I say, for example, I'm exposed to 40 degrees temperature for 2 hours and I'm sitting in an AC for, at a 24 degrees centigrade for 3 hours, we should have certain inputs coming to us indicating what should I do, whether I should go wash my face, whether I should go to a shaded locality, whether I should sit down, drink more water. These are the things which needs to be informed to people. And right now, that doesn't exist because our classification scale, our exposure scale, all our scientific understanding in this field is still very low. With more scientific understanding of evidence based inputs, are
Yeah.
going to guide and also help people in terms of what they need to do when there is a heat wave. So once
Okay.
people start understanding what they need to do when there is a heat wave, I think then the aspect of adaptation can be achieved easily. When it
Hmm.
comes to mitigation, I think ENS is something which was launched by the government with the support of technical institutions.
Yeah.
Econymous Samita is something which should be adopted for all buildings, or at least all new buildings which are coming up. That is going to reduce our usage of air conditioners, because air conditioners also generate heat. It just doesn't generate heat in your space where you have the air cooler or air conditioner, but the outside unit, it actually heats up and it keeps using electricity and it keeps running, and that also generates a lot of heat.
Yeah.
So how can we avoid these kinds of latent heat, or how we can minimize these kinds of latent heat, how we can minimize the emission? Of course, one of the biggest aspect of climate change or climate variability and change, which people are talking about, is the greenhouse effect. You know,
Yeah.
with more emissions, I think the greenhouse effect is going to actually capture the heat and not let it go out. That is also creating a huge impact globally. So
Yeah.
I think both the things should be tackled together. I think the aspect of emissions to reduce our consumption and
Yeah.
also reduce the various devices and surfaces which tend to radiate, absorb and radiate heat. If we start changing the materials, if we start using different kinds of approaches to satisfy some of our infrastructure, built infrastructure, I think
Yeah.
both the things together, adaptation and mitigation, will lead to a better livable city across the country.
Okay, that's great. And do you have some of the ideas? Like I do feel that in this aspect, then technologies like drone can also be quite useful. And any other such technologies do you see which might add to the points to map it or mitigate such kind of urban heat islands?
I think there are a lot of technologies which are available. We are, like I said, there is no dearth of tools and technologies. It is just how we use it, how we combine them together. One of the biggest challenges: how do we get data which is being collected by various people, by various these sensors into one single place, which can be accessed by both researcher and also by common people to take informed action. That is the biggest challenge. Getting all the data to one place is
Yeah.
a bigger challenge. But data is available. Like I said, every car is capturing that information. It is just that it's not made available to people.
Yeah.
There are very many sensors which are privately operated, owned and operated, but
Hmm.
that data once again is not made available. There are a lot of drone operators, people, companies which have come up, but they collect drone data for a certain area, and that data once again is not made public, or it doesn't go beyond the intended use. I think those are the things which we should be working towards. How do you create a system? How do you create a central repository? How do you create a mechanism in which people who are providing data are incentivized? How do you create a mechanism in which people can easily look at the data and not get overwhelmed by the complexity of it? How do we even go about creating surfaces? Because there are a lot of point data. How do you create a macro picture from all these point data? How do you
Yeah.
validate this information? These are the areas which require attention. But of course, with the technology, I'm quite positive that there are more number of sensors available. There are more number of instrumentations which are available. The size and the cost of the sensors have come down. The portability of the sensors have become much easier. So I think we have one good thing on one side, but the bad thing is how do we get the data? How do you use all that data for collective benefit?
Thank you so much. This was quite informative. Any last comments you would have, which I may have missed on this topic that you would like to share?
No, I see that India, there are three things which needs to happen. One at a policy level, that there is a certain kind of push which is happening, and Climate Smart City Assessment Framework is one such tool. ENS is another such tool. All these things are coming up to address the problem of heat. Heat action plan should be made mandatory across all cities, but it's very difficult to make it mandatory. But at least a guidance and principles, guiding principles, and the importance of it is something which needs to be brought to a larger awareness to both the research community and also to the administrative departments to make it functional. The third thing is, how do, until unless we start recording the deaths which occur due to heat wave, if we don't do that, if hospitals don't report, both private public hospitals don't report on that, I think we won't know where we are going. We will not know whether it is creating a drastic change. Therefore, they should also start doing that. And of course, tree plantation drives and maintaining the trees, maintaining the green areas in urban space is going to benefit all of the citizens. So that is something which needs to be strategically implemented.
Okay.
With that, I'll stop, Puneet, and
Thank you.
thank you for having me, and it was wonderful discussing around the urban heat island with you, and hopefully the audience did get some information and enjoyed the talk.
Thank you, Dr. Umamahesh. This surely was a very enriching talk to have, and I did gain a lot of it, and I hope our audience has also gained a lot of it from this topic. Thank you for your time.
You have been listening to Understanding the Future podcast. To know more about Climate Center for Cities, visit us at www.c-q.niua.org and follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. The show is conceptualized, hosted, and produced by Puneet Gandhi. You can listen to the show on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and Spotify. So don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends and colleagues. Thank you and stay tuned for the next episode.